Hello friends, today I am putting my most judgmental cap on to talk about my most unpopular book opinions. Before we start rioting in the streets, I want to disclaim that obviously these are my opinions. I feel like sometimes when you have a controversial opinion, it's kind of fun to indulge it as well, to get a little bit extreme with it. Within reason, obviously. I have to say that these opinions range quite a lot. Some of them are reasonable and some of them are totally unreasonable. And I want to put my hands up and acknowledge that, because sometimes you don't like a book and it is truly nothing to do with the book. It's the mindset you are in, and that's okay. Again, within reason, that's okay. First up, we have Bunny. Bunny is a story of a college girl who doesn't have many friends. She's doing like a very prestigious literature masters. Is it a masters? I think it's a masters. And she has these classmates who are in a clique and they all call each other Bunny. And they're all kind of obsessed with each other. It's all very frilly to the point where it feels sinister. Anyway, she ends up being invited to hang out with the clique, and turns out it's like an insane cult. One of the main criticisms Bunny garnered was that it sort of stops making sense, or at least it just becomes a bit ridiculous and sort of silly, and like the author loses a handle on what they're writing and where the story is going. But I have to say, and whether this is intentional or not, whether this is genius from the author or whether they genuinely did kind of lose the story a bit, I love it. Like, I loved that it got weird. Not that it got weird, I love that it sort of lost focus and that it became a bit confusing to read. I feel like that was part of the experience, that was part of the cultiness. So yeah, that's my first controversial opinion, that I love Bunny for its madness while others hate it. So we're really easing ourselves in with the controversial opinions. Next up on the chopping block is Everything I Know About Love. Now this book, people rave about it, but I found it okay. It's a memoir by Dolly, Alderton, and she basically talks about her life up until the age of, I think, sort of late 20s or 30s, as in, or early 30s. And she's just a bit of a mess, and the memoir is about her unmessing and learning that the real love is the friendships that we built along the way, which I know is like a meme joke, but that is actually kind of the message of the book. I just felt like a lot of it made me cringe. This is absolutely a me problem, I think, because I almost related too much to the book. I don't like, have you ever had this where you relate too much to the book but it feels like you've learnt those lessons already? It's a bit too real, and it's a few years too late, and so it ends up where maybe it would have hit and just like hit the spot really well if you had read it 5 years earlier. Reading it now, I just found really like, I definitely don't think I rated it that harshly on Goodreads. I think because of that awareness, because I felt like it would have been good at a slightly different time. But yeah, I didn't love it, and everyone else loved it. Next up, taking quite a sharp turn in terms of theme and just the book, like a very contrasting book. Next up we have Frankenstein, which obviously everyone raves about because it's famous and a classic and just so many remakes and so much excitement. So going into this book, I mean, I didn't have crazy expectations because sometimes classics just don't quite, like, you don't relate to them, or they're a bit dated or whatever. But I had reasonable ones, and I absolutely hated Frankenstein. If you don't know, it's about a scientist who creates a monster and then spends the rest of his life kind of hating the monster, running from the monster, and then the monster's like, why don't you love me? And it wasn't what I expected, in the sense, to be fair, they are angling it like you are sort of meant to sympathize with the monster, and it does become this question of parental responsibility, and, you know, Frankenstein was a bad guy, kind of, and he was sort of framed like that, but I just found the Frankenstein character insufferable to the point where I just hated the book, because the book focused so much on listening to his whining and his self-pity, when he just all along the way he's super selfish, very manipulative actually, and just a really dodgy person. And I feel like people don't talk enough about how dodgy Frankenstein is. Or maybe they do, and I'm just not in the right forums. But yeah, hate Frankenstein so much. Next up we have Where the Crawdads Sing. This book, it's just so overrated. It's meant to be this like really fun love story, and obviously it got made into a film, so it's meant to have some legs. But ultimately it was just so cliche, and actually in parts kind of like problematic in the way it's meant to be this incredible love story, but they actually treat her pretty terribly. You have this main character who's like the swamp girl, and I mean that in itself was a big cringe point for me, because she's sort of, ooh, swamp girl who's grown up in the swamps and is really poor, but oh, she also happens to be really hot and intriguing and like not like other girls, and every man she meets falls in love with her. Which as a trope just grinds my gears. What else did I hate about this book? It also had a lot of the intimate scenes just did not sit right with me. They were actually quite bad, but I don't think the author wrote them in a way that implied that they were trying to actually present them as bad. And I was a bit like, ooh. So yeah, overall, so overhyped, but beyond that, also a bit problematic. And actually I think there is a really problematic context to it around the author. Next up, and I love to bash this book, I love to bash it so much, is Atomic Habits, which is a kind of self-help book. And as a huge disclaimer, I don't generally read self-help books. I don't love them anyway, but everyone raves about Atomic Habits. I was like, oh fine, I'll give it a read. And I did, and I just thought it could have been half the length, and some of it could have been bullet pointed. So there are some really good lessons in there, but a lot of it was just felt like really repetitive. I disagree with the hype. I know a lot of people really love it though, so I guess my advice would just be to read the first half and then stop. I did read until the end, so I'm not just saying this as someone who's only read the first half, like I read the whole book. Next up, I really should have ordered these in some way, because I feel like this list is just whiplash. We're going from one type of book to another, and I apologise. Next up we have A Little Life. I have controversial opinions within myself that then another part of myself disagrees with this book. I mean, it's like all I've been talking about for the last few videos, so in case you didn't know, I did really enjoy the book, but I feel very strongly that it's kind of just pain for the sake of pain. And I think maybe that's just where my capacity for like art ends, is just before A Little Life, because I do believe that was the point. If you read author interviews, God, I keep forgetting to tell you what the books are about. A Little Life is about a man, it's his whole life, basically, his whole little life in New York, and he's got his college friends, and he has this mysterious past, and he's kind of got some mental and physical scars, and then all is revealed as it goes on. But it basically turns out he's had like an incredibly traumatic past, and actually present as the book goes on. And if you read author interviews and stuff, the author actually does talk about how she wanted to write a character who never gets better. And that's a quote. It's like, I wanted to write a character who never gets better. And she wanted to explore this thing of like some amounts of trauma people never recover from, which I think as a pursuit is really weird. I think it's something that should be understood from a scientific perspective, but writing like a book about it and writing a kind of having it as an entertainment piece really shows that. I think what's interesting as well, I haven't seen the play, but from what I've heard, so a lot of the criticism is around how the play, obviously things had to be shortened and dialogue had to replace a lot of the prose, and apparently for that reason the play has highlighted the parts of the book that I don't like. Like, I was carried through the book because the writing is incredible, but without the incredible writing, it does just become a relentless story of pain and nothing more. Next up, we have I'm Glad My Mum Died, which is Jennette McCurdy, who's a former child star. She was on Nickelodeon. It's her memoir up until the age of late 20s. I'm actually really into memoirs, and this is a memoir that sparked my getting into memoirs phase, I guess. The reason why this book is on this list, I did actually really enjoy it. It's a pretty difficult story because she talks about how she was abused by the people she worked for / with and her mother primarily, and then her mother ends up dying, and so it kind of talks about that grief quite a lot. And the controversial opinion that I have is that I cannot understand why anyone would find this book funny. It was described as funny by a lot of people. A lot of people said they laughed out loud. And although I completely respect the authors, like if they want to have a lot of humor in it, and like if that's a coping mechanism, if that's just the way they're writing about their life, completely fair enough. But I do really struggle with the idea that you can be detached enough to be reading about such intensely traumatic events in someone else's life and laugh and kind of be in on the joke. So yeah, I just did not find it funny at all, even though that's how it was touted. The closest I can get is I can see that she has a humorous tone. I can see that she's very dry, and then if you watch interviews and stuff, you're like, okay, she's a funny person and has a sense of humor. Next up, and these I actually read ages ago, so it's a little bit weird that they're on the list. I feel like I just have a bit of a vendetta against them because the opinion is so strong. And these are the last two. Number one is I Am Pilgrim, which was massively hyped years ago when it first came out. I can't remember when it first came out, but I read it on holiday and I read the whole thing. Like it was good enough to keep me going, and it was sort of entertaining, but I could not understand why people loved this book. And it ended up feeling like, you know, when you're reading a book and it just feels like the author thinks they're the main character, and it becomes quite hard to enjoy it because it feels like a really like self-congratulatory, especially the way that he wrote about some of the interactions with women. It was very kind of like he was just trying to James Bondify himself, and maybe I'm being way too harsh, but it just instantly puts me off. I mean, that like in itself is fine. Obviously a lot of things are kind of semi-autobiographical and stuff like that, but it's more that you can see that they see themselves in the character, and therefore the character is painted as a bit of a sort of like flawless hero, or even worse than that. And that's what I found in this book. He wasn't a flawless hero, he was kind of a where they sort of throw in a few flaws as a token, but even the flaws are still meant to be like impressive or ultimately heroic or positive in some way. Again, it's like the James Bond thing of like, oh, he's so damaged, how sexy of him, you know? Next up, we have Do No Harm. This book is, can you describe this as a memoir? It's basically written by a neurosurgeon, and each chapter is a different case in his life, as in a different case in his work life. So it'll be like, oh, X person had X tumor or like disease. And he uses the cases to kind of reflect on life and death and all the big questions. And I think it was a decent book. I think kind of similar to the self-help book genre. I'm not a fan of this type of book anyway. The thing is, I found it quite unstructured. It's not chronological, because it's case-based. So the story flows like that, except I found it didn't flow that well. And I also found some of the lessons a bit repetitive. I totally get the hype, but I do think it was reaching for something a bit more that it just missed. So I came away from it pretty disappointed. But I also think I set my standard unreasonably high. I wouldn't scare people away from it, if that's what you're wondering. Honestly, I've become really, I don't tend to have crazy unpopular opinions. I say this. Maybe the last 20 minutes were highly controversial with me. Anyway, that's it from me. I've actually got a really juicy and fun video coming up next week, and so that's why this one's a bit more cash. You all, why am I trying to abbreviate? I am becoming the embarrassing adult that I never thought I'd be. I always thought I'd be a cool adult, you know, not like other adults. Anyway, I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.